Anger from the U.S. public toward bankers is high since the financial crisis of 2008. But the industry is still playing a big role in the presidential race. Whoever gets to the White House, is it always Wall Street that wins? You're watching Inside Story, U.S. 2012 from Washington. Thanks for joining us. I'm Lisa Fletcher. The Republican Party may have its doubts about him, but when it comes to Wall Street, it is a completely different story. Financial executives are throwing their support and their money behind Mitt Romney's bid for the White House. Recently released figures show Wall Street's shifted its support toward the former Massachusetts governor and away from President Barack Obama. A campaign monitoring group found that in 2011, the leaders of 6 Wall Street giants gave nearly $2 million to Mitt Romney's campaign. They've also been joined by hedge fund managers and private equity leaders who've been pouring money into Romney's unofficial Political Action Committee, or Super PAC, the machine behind his now infamous campaign attack ads. It underscores the influence that Wall Street has on U.S. politics. Romney himself is a former private equity executive. And it's not just the Republicans. Barack Obama won the presidency thanks in no small part to the investment firm Goldman Sachs, who was the biggest backer of his 2008 campaign. And despite tough talk about reining in the excesses of the bankers, President Obama's government is peppered with former finance industry executives or figures close to Wall Street. So what role will Wall Street play in the 2012 election? With me to discuss this in the studio is Ford O'Connell, a Republican strategist who used to work on John McCain's campaign. Next to him, Bob Biersack, senior fellow from the Center for Responsive Politics, which monitors campaign funds. And from New York, Richard Wolff, professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts. Thanks to all of you for being here. I want to start by talking about the true role of money from Wall Street in politics. And Richard, I want to start with you. Is its influence overestimated?
No, I think it is mostly underestimated. Here's the basic reality. Over the last 30 to 40 years, the single most rapidly growing sector of our economy has been finance. And the center of finance is Wall Street. So this is a part of our economy that has become relatively powerful, much richer, and dominates in many ways our economic system. At the same time, we've had a growing gap between rich and poor, making the rich have more resources to throw into politics and the poor less. You put those two trends together and you put Wall Street at the apex of shaping what is and is not discussed in Washington, who does and who does not win political office. It gives them an inordinate power, which they relish, but it also gives them a responsibility for the outcome. And since we're now in the 5th year of an economic crisis, that's an outcome that doesn't make them look good or appeal to most Americans.
I want to take a look at the finance industry's sweeping impact on all federal election campaigns in the U.S. in just the last year or so. Wall Street has outspent all other special interest groups in all areas of this year's national election, which includes not just the presidency, but also races for Congress. The majority of its cash, nearly 53%, went to Republicans compared to 32% for Democrats. Wall Street's biggest donor, the multinational investment giant Goldman Sachs. It was also President Obama's top contributor in 2008. But so far, Wall Street has given more than $12 million to Mitt Romney's official campaign, twice as much as President Obama. Ford O'Connell, with that kind of money flowing out of Wall Street, is it possible for a candidate to run a campaign independent of Wall Street influence?
Well, it is possible to run a presidential campaign independent of Wall Street because we're in a new super PAC era where individual candidate campaigns are not as important as, say, the super PACs themselves, which are third-party entities which are trying to control the message of the elections. That said, though, Wall Street's no dummy. They're going to play both sides of the aisle, and candidates will need money from Wall Street. The only question is how much.
Bob Biersack, your specialty is following the money.
In fact, Wall Street always has played both sides, relatively equal percentages to Democrats and Republicans in the last 20 years. More to Republicans this year, really for the first time in a significant period of time. The other thing that's important to remember, though, is that the rules have changed in important ways. And it gives everybody Wall Street included, more flexibility this year than they've ever had before to bring lots of money to bear on specific issues or specific races in a very short time in relatively unpredictable ways. And so there's a lot more uncertainty in the process and a lot more flexibility for groups like Wall Street investors or pharmaceutical companies or all kinds of other economic interests too.
So that flexibility, of course, also has with it anonymity, Richard. And talk about the impact that that has on the election process.
Well, I think you're seeing a kind of a degradation of our political process. It used to be a joke that we have the best democracy money can buy or the best government money can buy. But it's no longer a joke. It is no longer said with humor. It is said with bitterness by growing numbers of Americans that everything we have and don't have in the way of decisions to make to shape this country at a time when we need it more than ever is all being manipulated by a handful of economic interests who are in a position to throw wild amounts of money into shaping the people, the issues, what is brought up, what is kept off the table. And I think that is becoming, in this country, as it has already become in Europe, a central defining problem in the society that goes beyond economics and is now dividing the country politically, ideologically, and ethically.
But when we look at this, when we look at the amount of money, whether or not we know its source or its source is anonymous, I think especially for our international viewers, they may be asking themselves the question, are Americans stupid? Do they have the inability to discern where this money is coming from? What does this say about American voters?
Well, I think that may be an issue with regard to the super PACs now. I think transparency, to Richard's point, is a big issue, but money in America, at least in terms of campaign contributions, is seen as free speech. So it is up to the voter to do a little bit more research, but it is quite obvious at the same time where the money's coming from, though folks like Bob help out.
There are real threats to transparency in this cycle that we haven't seen before. The super PACs that we're getting reports from now, they're disclosing their donors. And so it's relatively straightforward. It's a lot of money, but it's relatively straightforward to know where it's coming from. The challenge comes perhaps later in the campaign when these groups that we call 501c4 organizations, they're issue groups that are allowed to spend money now based on these new court decisions just as freely and flexibly as anyone else, but they don't have to disclose their donors. And so we could see millions of dollars in unattributed funds coming into the process at critical times during the general election, and that would be new. And that's a real threat.
And to the voter, that can be a real issue because a lot of it is going to be negative advertising. And it's very hard to sort of parse through that and see what is real and what isn't. And I think that that is the biggest concern, and a concern that I think we all share moving forward in the U.S. election cycle. That said, though, money in politics is nothing new. It does go to both sides of the aisle. Wall Street does play both sides, and really the American voter knows that.
And it's happened a lot over the years. The money has been available to different sources in different ways. In the 80s and 90s, it was soft money, right? Corporate money, unlimited individual contributions going directly to the parties. Now the difference is it goes to these outside groups. The parties are prohibited from taking it. But it can be used in spending directly on the election. Very specific messages, vote for this candidate, defeat this candidate. And that's different from what we've seen before.
We've heard from Foster Friess, the somewhere south of $1 billion funder to the Santorum campaign, who has said, while that may be true, we can point to several billionaires in recent history who have thrown a lot of money to beat a certain candidate and it hasn't worked. You can look at Meg Whitman's campaign. She was trying to become the governor of California, spent, I don't know, $165 million. The voters still couldn't be bought, and she lost the election. Is that a reasonable argument?
It is because of the fact that money isn't everything in politics. You do have to have a message, and you do have to know your electoral environment, and you have to know sort of who your audience is. Right now, money is not going to be as big of an issue in these campaigns, and why these third-party super PACs can help the eventual Republican nominee, because the biggest concern for most American voters right now is not necessarily Wall Street, although they're very unhappy with Wall Street. It's the fact that unemployment is at or above 8% and gas prices continue to climb. If you can't eat and you can't work, you're not so concerned about Wall Street right now.
Sometimes the more you spend, the worse you do. Because ultimately the message gets out there and people evaluate the message on its own. So you have the Whitman example, or Carly Fiorina in the Senate race in California is a similar case. There have been cases in the past where candidates had unlimited amounts of their own money that they could put into the process, and it was just a mistake to spend it.
And that's true. And one of the recent things that we did see, though, was in the Florida Republican primary, Newt Gingrich's message got drowned out because he was basically carpet bombed with negative ads and caused him to get off message and lose his mind essentially on the campaign trail. That said, though, you're right. It's not always a sort of telltale sign based on how much money is spent.
Richard Wolff?
Yeah, I think there's another way of looking at this. Sometimes people are so disgusted by the amount of money thrown in, as in the Meg Whitman case, that it becomes a negative rather than a positive because the other side can use the avalanche of money to turn it around against. I think more importantly is the fact that the overwhelming amount of money is able, by giving it to both parties, to make the two parties more and more similar, specifically around those issues of concern to the donors. Let me give you an example. We had, the last time in this country, a Great Depression in the 1930s. We went after that, halfway through, by a massive program of federal employment. We have terrible unemployment now, lasting into the third and fourth year. There's not a word about a public employment problem or a program the way we had it in the 1930s. It's as if we had a collective amnesia that what we did last time can't even be discussed now. I think that the overwhelming preponderance of money coming into politics has, as one of its own unspoken objectives, to keep that question off the agenda so neither party brings it up, and neither party therefore runs the risk of offending Wall Street and other corporate money that has its own agendas and is equally happy if one or the other party panders to it.
Well, speaking of amnesia, and if not amnesia, at least confusion, it seems that President Obama's tone toward Wall Street has shifted. Let's take a listen.
We need a plan that helps families stay in their homes and workers keep their jobs. A plan that gives hard-working Americans relief instead of using taxpayer dollars to reward CEOs on Wall Street. The unemployed worker can rightly challenge the excesses of Wall Street without demonizing all who work there.
Richard Wolff, is there ever a moment of truth for the candidates, a point at which they have to reconcile the fact that the very industries that are funding them are the same ones that brought Americans to the brink of financial disaster a couple of years ago?
Well, I think what you have is a recognition by Obama that his left-wing or progressive base is very unhappy with him, sees him as having caved in to Wall Street pretty much, and that to regain some support among them, at least so they don't stay home and sit on their hands, he has to make some noises about what they're concerned about. But he's done that before, and it never goes much beyond noise. We've had 4 programs, count them, 4 programs to help people who've had their homes taken away from them get back in. None of them has worked so far. None of them looks likely to work in the future. So you periodically run the run, you talk the talk, but the people who fund you understand that you're holding on to your base rather than changing the basic support you've given to the financial sector from the beginning of this crisis.
So you're throwing folks a bone, but it's generally hollow?
That's right.
Ford, how does this resonate with voters in terms of, the influence of Wall Street? Are voters disgusted by that? Are they angered by it? Or is it just a non-issue at this point?
Well, I think that voters are angered by the fact that some on Wall Street keep getting richer and a lot of voters see their job opportunities limited. But again, I'm not so sure that Wall Street per se is something that they're most concerned about as they are about sort of getting America back to work and which side has the best plan to do that. And I think one of the things that the Wall Street folks have really been very successful about, but the Republicans have not done a good job messaging, is we're not going to have long-term economic growth in this country until the regulatory system's fixed and until the tax code system's fixed. And that's very hard for the Republicans to message, but should they message it in sort of this down economic environment, there will very well could be a new president in the White House come 2012.
The money comes in a variety of directions, too. It's not just campaign funds. It's lobbying. It's all the efforts to influence policy. It's experts who will come and argue their cases, all of which is perfectly legitimate. Everybody's got a point of view, and everybody's allowed to express that to the government. That's pretty important. The problem is when the government looks like they can't act. They're paralyzed by conflicting interests or by the money in the system or whatever. And also, it's very important, I think, that people not perceive that the rules are fixed for one portion of the economy or another, one portion of the population or another. that they feel like everybody has a fair shake. And sometimes we can get into this system where even campaign finance regulation can become so complex and convoluted and can become the subject for Stephen Colbert every night. That's when you have a challenge. That's when there's a problem, when people look at it so cynically that they just throw up their hands and decide that the game is fixed and it's rigged. And that's something we really have to look at.
With the constantly changing rules, I think the uncertainty out there, both in the business sector and in sort of the campaign finance, has really created a lot of cynics among the American electorate.
Right.
You know, we started the show with this premise that no matter who ends up in the White House, does Wall Street always come out the winner? Bob, in terms of breaking down the money and seeing where it goes, we know that it's shifted slightly away from Obama, but is it dramatic, and is the money, are they hedging their bets on both sides, Wall Street?
Oh, as they always have, and presumably always will, because ultimately what you want is access to the political process, access to the Congress, access to the administration. And when elections are unpredictable, when they're going to be close, then you have to hedge your bets. It's not a disastrous effect on the Obama campaign. That campaign will be fine. They're raising lots of money in small contributions, and they'll be okay going forward.
Well, I think that the Obama campaign is going to have more resources than whoever the eventual Republican nominee is. That said, though, if President Obama wants to go after, say, Mitt Romney's the nominee and tries to sort of paint him as a Wall Street insider, he's going to have a very hard time, given where he's gotten his money from, because he's still getting money from Wall Street. And folks like Secretary Geithner and others who are Wall Streeters in his administration, if he tries to go after Mitt Romney as a Wall Street insider, frankly, Mitt Romney looks like a secretary to Merrill Lynch, sort of branch office in South Dakota, frankly, compared to what's going on. So they're both tied to it, whoever it is. And I think that eventually Wall Street right now is hoping that the Republican nominee, if they can compete, they'll get behind them because they want to see things like Dodd-Frank sort of moved out of the way for now.
Speaking of those ties, let's take a little bit of a closer look at that. Some of whom have worked in the Obama administration do have very close ties to Wall Street, or they have been featured heavily in his administration. Among them, Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner, who Ford was just talking about, who was criticized for his instrumental role in ensuring big banks were paid in full from a taxpayer bailout of AIG Insurance during the financial crisis. Larry Summers, who served as Obama's chief economic advisor. Under Bill Clinton, he was a champion of financial deregulation and later earned millions from Wall Street companies. And all three who served as Obama's chief of staff are former Wall Street executives. So neither gets away from it, do they?
Nobody's pure in this process.
No.
Yeah, that's almost always true.
That's the point. That's the point. You know, you pay both sides, then you're sure that either one or the other can't move anywhere because they're all complicit. They all have their hands in the cookie jar at Wall Street. They've all benefited from it. Nobody can really accuse the other one. And so the game continues, nothing changes, and the same top-down economics, trickle down that never trickles, becomes the rule of the day that neither of the two parties dares to depart from. Then you have Wall Street winning out. It really doesn't matter in the end for them which one wins because they've tied them all up in the same ball, and they have to be complicit with a system that isn't working, but for which any real debate is precluded because it can't get the financing to break in.
And all of this money that's given on both sides is not done just out of pure generosity. It's done because there's an agenda. And we're not talking about, quid pro quo corruption. We're talking about more subtle ways that they curry favor in terms of politics and legislation and policies. Kind of talk a little bit about that, how that happens.
Usually there are two approaches. One is I'm just interested in access to the system. And that's been the way typically institutions have pursued money in politics over the years. I want to make sure that when I call a congressman or a committee chairman or somebody in the White House, that they'll call me back and that they'll listen to my point of view. And it's a mistake probably to oversimplify these issues in terms of there's a right answer, there's a good position and a bad one. You don't want an administration or a Congress that's ignorant of the way in which the finance system works, for example. You need to have enough information to make good judgments about what regulation should be.
Because we know that Congress isn't so far, so.
Right, and good judgments are always in the eye of the beholder. It's a difficult thing to come to some objective truth. That's almost never true. So you weigh the arguments, you listen to the debate, and you try to sort through it. The question that Richard's addressing is whether or not they're even able to make a good objective sorting of that process when the noise around them is one-sided or just directed for one point of view. And that's the hard thing to overcome.
And I think it becomes even harder for a lot of legislators and chief executives when it's election year. That's really where we see it, and it's very hard to make good legislative decisions when you're up for re-election in the ballot box, because you really have to play the electoral wins, and I think that that's the biggest concern. I mean, we're seeing this right now. Republicans have been touting we need fixes to the corporate tax code, and we now hear that President Obama says, you want to know what? We need fixes to the corporate tax code. We're going to drop it from 35 to 28%. Now, is that a hollow marker? Sure. But is it an election marker? Absolutely. And that's where he recognizes what's going on. And the question is we do need wholesale changes to the tax code. The question is whether that's just a campaign promise to get more money and to win re-election, or is that what's actually going to happen? We don't know. Sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes good legislation does come out of elections. But again, we're beholden to the need to win at the ballot box.
Richard?
I think it's not a question of what issues are raised, but how they're raised. Let's take the example of the tax code. We're talking about reducing the corporate tax code from 35 to 28%. That's going to be the debate. That's framing the debate. Here's an alternative way to think about taxes that never gets discussed. In the 50s and 60s, the top income tax bracket for the richest Americans was 91%. Today, it's 35%. No one on earth has gotten a tax cut like that over the last 30 or 40 years. Why, if we're discussing the tax code, are we not talking about the reasons why we ought to go back towards the levels of taxations we had for rich people in the 50s and 60s, a time when unemployment was less than it is today and economic growth faster? I mean, if you're going to talk about these issues, then put them fairly on the table. What the money from Wall Street and big corporations does is make sure that if the issue gets on the table, it gets on in a way that they want to control, where they win either way. They either get a cut to 28% or they get some loopholes, and that's what we discuss instead of the broad-based tax questions that ought to be on the table and that they, with their money, can keep off.
Who forces those questions on the table, though?
Well, obviously the electoral landscape is forcing it right now, but the question is going to become with who's going to frame the argument the best, and when it does get on the table, whose lobbyists are going to be the ones that sort of gerrymander the issue.
Let's talk a little bit about the Occupy Wall Street movement, because it gained international headlines, and you couldn't turn on the TV or open up the newspaper without reading something about it. It has waned in its presence. What influence, if any, do you think that they will have in the election, and how do they square up with Wall Street?
Richard, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'm sure I can tell you about that. My life personally has completely transformed over the last 6 months because of the Occupy movement. I go all over the country speaking, and I can't handle the size and enthusiasm of audiences. What Occupy did in a few short months was put this question of the 1% versus the 99% into the public discourse, on the public consciousness, and it is now seeping into everything else. The anger at Wall Street is because they are perceived correctly as part of the 1% and part of the problem of a country divided this way that are controlling the political landscape. And I think Wall Street has not yet understood, nor have the leading politicians, the force, the spread, and the depth of the kind of anger that Occupy put forward. And whether or not they revived to the level they were in the fall, they have changed this country in ways we're only beginning to see unfold around us.
Well, and so it may be that the biggest challenge to the political system is how that gets manifested beyond the campaign. If it becomes, as it is now, pretty stereotypical that Washington doesn't work, that you can't get good policy out of Congress or out of any administration because of these influences, because of the challenges, because of the complexity of all these things, and they're paralyzed in Washington. If that becomes the common perception, the problem that people have is, so what do I do? How do I change the system in order for it to be more effective, in order for it to actually move forward, whether it be addressing the 99% or something else? And if we just have frustration, then the whole process becomes somewhat more unpredictable. And it's not the money that's necessarily driving that. It's how you manifest it.
I think people are turning away. They're turning away from the politics and from the political parties because they see it corrupted by the money, and therefore a hopeless way to try to change a basic system that is no longer working for them. And I think you're opening the space for which Tea Party on one end, Occupy movement on the other. Those are the beginnings of a movement of the people to find alternative ways. And the image there is the Arab Spring and other kinds of direct action, which is where I think, from my experience, the American people's frustration is now taking them, while Wall Street and the politics continue to play as though the old game has no longer anything to worry about. I think they're making a classic error of judgment.
Gentlemen, we are going to have to leave it at that. Thank you so much for joining us for our discussion. That's it from the Inside Story team in Washington, D.C. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about our program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at InsideStory@aljazeera.net.